Trump's chief financial officer, Alan Weisselberg, is now talking to the feds with immunity. Weisselberg is the guy who prepared Trump's tax returns we haven't seen yet. He oversaw all of the Trump Organization financial transaction and infrastructure, including, apparently, the hush money. Now, the feds referred to Weisselberg as Executive 1 in the Michael Cohen court documents. All right, joining me now is former federal prosecutor Seth Waxman, Shelby Holliday from the Wall Street Journal, and Gwenda Blair, author of the Trumps. Great to have all of you with us. And Gwenda, we should say, is obviously an expert on the Trumps, writing one of the, I guess, definitive books on the family. Shelby, let me begin with you, and let's talk a little bit about Weisselberg. Who exactly is this man in the center of Trump world, if you will?
He's an incredibly important figure, and hat tip to my colleagues at the Journal for breaking this story that he has immunity. There are some questions about the extent of his immunity, what questions he has to answer if he's sharing information just about those hush money payments or information well beyond those. But he's an incredibly important figure who's been with the Trump Organization for decades, before Trump even took over from his father. So he's been with Trump through bankruptcies, through the reality TV saga, through all of his booms and busts. He knows where the proverbial bodies are buried. We've heard that a lot today. But he's also very much in control of Trump's finances now that Trump is president. And so he could know really important things for the grand jury in Mueller's investigation, for example, if he is actually cooperating with them and sharing information with them as well.
So I don't know if you've ever had a chance to interview Weisselberg. Well, tell us a little bit more about him as a person. I mean, what did you learn about him? What did you glean from him as a personality, the way he functioned within that world? Was he meticulous? Did he sound, or did he come across as like the person who would be extremely loyal to President Trump? And why would you think he would seek immunity?
I don't want to suggest we were BFFs, but what I did, my impressions and my recollections when I did interview him when I was doing my book, he worked for Fred first, for Donald's father. So he was a continuity from that, the earlier version of the Trump Organization under his father. And Donald Trump, we have to remember, the big influences on him, School of Fred, that was one of them. So this was a guy who already, this is Alan Weisselberg, was somebody who'd already been part of that world where, you know, be incredibly sharp business dealing, squeeze everything you can out of your...
So he's definitely a holdover from the Fed era, excuse me.
Fed era.
How much do you think he actually knew about the Trump world? I mean, if you had to quantify it,
pretty much everything. And when I interviewed them, the Trump Organization, one of the things I think people learned through the campaign, it had a remarkably small number of people working there. So whoever did work there knew a lot.
So how worried do you think Trump is, since you know the Trumps and the Trump world, Donald Trump Jr., Eric Trump, since they were the ones, along with Weisselberg, after the election, who were in charge of the Trump Organization, how worried are they all this evening?
I would say pretty much 100%. This guy was right at the center, super loyal, eyes down. He was, when I interviewed him, very, you know, low profile, but, you know, meticulous, eye shade guy, totally focused on getting, you know, doing the best for the Trump Organization in terms of taxes and everything else. But he knew it all. He knew it all.
Seth, let me ask you a little bit about Weisselberg here and the fact that he is sought immunity. We don't know if it was necessarily something that they offered initially, or is it something he sought and then they ultimately, the feds ultimately offered it to him. But what does that tell you, the fact that they were willing to grant him immunity, that he now has immunity, about what kind of information he may have and what it is that investigators can be looking for that he would know?
Yeah, I mean, he may have the keys to the castle. I mean, in white-collar criminal prosecutions and investigations, it's the books and records, it's the documents, it's the business transactions. And to land someone like the CFO, the chief financial officer, someone by all accounts, as your guests are saying, has been tight with the Trump Organization for decades, who can walk prosecutors through those transactions, like one of your guests said, you know, where the bodies are buried, and breathe life into those documents. That is a huge get for the government, along with Mr. Pecker and, of course, Mr. Cohen potentially into the fold. Those kinds of professional advisors that you know, lend their expertise can really build a white-collar criminal prosecution and, of course, corroborate each other, which is key to any kind of investigation.
Seth, do you know, in a situation like this, I mean, and it's hard to speculate about this case, but do you know, is it it something that feds or investigators offer up early on, immunity, because they know somebody legally is liable, or to try to win him over easily? Or do you think that it's something that you negotiate, you trade information back and forth to get to this point?
Yeah, the latter. I mean, prosecutors hate to give out immunity. They want to get the testimony straight up, and if at worst, get someone to plead to something because they clearly have exposure if they're pleading or seeking immunity. But if you can't get any of that done, and kind of as a last resort, you immunize someone to get the information. And so you only do that in circumstances typically where the person has something really good and you really want it. And so it seems like, you know, from what we're seeing, that may be the case here.
Yeah, it seems certainly, and what a week it has been for some of these associates. Shelby, I wanted to ask you that when it comes to the associates who are guilty or those that have been given immunity, like David Pecker and Weisselberg, you have them there on the screen. The Trump associates granted immunity on one side, the Trump associates that are guilty and cooperating on the other. A lot of people in Trump's inner circle working with the government now. What does that tell you?
Well, I think there are three sort of pillars here. You have the foundation, you have the business, and you have the campaign. And the people cooperating come from all of those worlds, which is probably a very scary thing for the president, because we know all three of those things are being investigated. I think the people who are cooperating in terms of what they know on the campaign, some of them know a great deal. I think Rick Gates was there through the home stretch. He was close not just to Manafort, but also on the campaign and stayed to help through the inauguration. And then you have people like Weisselberg and Cohen. Cohen's been in Trump's world, and I know Trump is trying to distance himself right now and say, he just did small deals for me. He wasn't really a fixer. You know, he's downplaying Cohen's role, but Cohen was in a lot of meetings. Yeah. He was setting up a lot of arrangements. I think that tape where Cohen's talking about Weisselberg is fascinating, because you could probably argue that Weisselberg didn't really know all the dirty details, and then when you hear that tape, it suggests he actually...
Okay, so let me pick up on that point, which is a really interesting question. Weisselberg knowing about what the payments were necessarily for. The Wall Street Journal reports that Mr. Trump was known for being meticulous about payments the company made. Mr. Weisselberg would bring Trump checks to sign for the company on a daily basis. Is it at all plausible that any of the Cohen reimbursements that were made were, A, maybe not necessarily aware to Weisselberg what they were for? You know, in fact, if they were just told, like, these are reimbursements, he would just process them as such? Or could it be possible the other way around, that Trump did not necessarily know, but Weisselberg would certainly know what they were for? What do you think, based on what you've learned over the years with the Trump organization?
Trump was a real micromanager. He signed every check. They all went in front of him. He wanted to know what they were for. Sometimes he wouldn't pay them, as the Journal reported. Yeah. Sometimes he'd, like, you know, put off payment, squeeze this guy a little bit more, don't pay the full amount. He was a guy who knew what he was doing. So the idea that he ever signed a check and didn't know what it was for, I think that's a non-starter.
For Trump.
For Trump.
So, and Weisselberg.
And Weisselberg, that guy was on top of it. He was central. The staff, there was hardly anybody there. That was one of the startling things to me when I interviewed Donald at his office. There were not very many people working there, and there never were very many people working there.
Are you at all surprised, and we'll put this back up on the screen when we show these 5 people, 2 that have been granted immunity, David Pecker as well as Weisselberg, and on the other side, those that are cooperating with the government that have pleaded guilty, Michael Flynn, Papadopoulos, Rick Gates. From somebody who's researched the Trump world, are you at all surprised that loyalty has not turned out to be as strong of a force in the Trump orbit, that these men are all cooperating, or to some extent are willing to offer information on their boss, who's always put a premium on loyalty?
Well, end of day. They've staved it off as long as they can. But one of the telling things, I think, is that Weisselberg, so far, Trump has not tried to diss him. Yeah. He's tried to say Cohen, it didn't matter. Paul Manafort, he was just there for a few days. We have not heard that Alan Weisselberg wasn't the main guy in charge of finances for decades. He has not said that. And he's also not, he hasn't come out with some kind of, you know, like, kind of dissing nickname for him.
Yeah, I mean, he's distanced himself from, he's distanced himself from Michael Cohen, saying he did small deals. He distanced himself from Paul Manafort, saying he only worked on the campaign a little bit. Why do you think he hasn't done that with Alan Weisselberg? And why do you think Alan Weisselberg has sought immunity, or now has immunity?
There's a lot of talk, a lot of comparison of Donald Trump to some kind of mob boss, that kind of model. Yeah. But is Alan Weisselberg, is he a made man? Maybe that's the question.
We're going to talk a little bit.
I don't know.
We are definitely going to talk a little bit about that kind of culture that exists in the Trump world later on in the show. Seth, really quickly, would state charges take away a Michael Cohen pardon as a potential tool for Trump? We know he's trying to kind of perhaps signal that to Paul Manafort with some of the comments and language and the tweets saying he's a brave man and all that. If there are state charges, would that neutralize a presidential pardon?
Yeah, it sure would. I mean, Mr. Trump, the president, has the power to pardon in the federal system, but not in the state system. The governor of New York could pardon someone. Of course, there's no indication that would happen. So to the extent the Manhattan DA brings charges against Michael Cohen or anyone else, the president will not be able to pardon those.
What do you think right now, Seth, in terms of the investigators? What is the big picture here that they're trying to put together when it comes to President Trump through the people like Michael Cohen, David Pecker, and Alan Weisselberg? What is the big picture that they're trying to assemble?
Two stages. The first is Don Jr. and Kushner, and the second is the president himself. You know, getting these close associates, what in criminal context and when I was a prosecutor used to call top lieutenants, either in the financial area or, you know, people like Michael Cohen, getting them into the fold brings you that much closer to the president. And if it's not the president right away, maybe it's Jared Kushner or Don Jr. And if you get to one of those two, then maybe you're right on the doorstep to the presidency. So Mr. Mueller is working this up as a classic federal investigation. You know, he's checking all the boxes, dotting all the I's and T's, and he looks like he's moving closer and closer. Yeah,
and to Shelby's point, you had this kind of triangle between the Trump Organization, the Trump Foundation, and the campaign. Seth, I'm going to ask you to stay with me for a little bit longer. Shelby Holliday, Gwenda Blair, thank you very much for being here. Appreciate your time. All right, now to Donald Trump potentially undermining his own claims of innocence by using language that is more commonly associated with crime bosses and mob movies. Today, NBC confirming another top Trump figure struck a deal with the feds, the Trump Organization's CFO getting immunity in the Cohen probe. It's part of a pattern of Trump associates spilling the beans. This just a day after Trump blasted what he calls flippers.
This whole thing about flipping, they call it. I know all about flipping. For 30, 40 years, I've been watching flippers. It almost ought to be outlawed. It's not fair. I've had many friends involved in this stuff. It's called flipping, and it almost ought to be illegal.
All right, so in recent days, Trump has been saying that the White House counsel isn't a rat. He's been praising Paul Manafort because he, quote, refused to break, and blasting Jeff Sessions for failing to match Trump's, quote, loyalty. It's a mindset not often found in the White House, but in films like this.
Don't ever take sides with anyone against the family again.
And you learn the two greatest things in life. Never rat on your friends, and always keep your mouth shut.
All our people are businessmen. Their loyalty is based on that. One thing I learned from Pop was to try to think as people around you think.
All right, joining me now is NBC News analyst Howard Fineman, and back with me once again, Seth Waxman, who spent 8 years prosecuting organized crime figures like some of those that we saw portrayed on TV. Seth, let me begin with you. You've been in this position before. Is the way Trump acting a sign that he feels backed into a corner? The language, the posturing, is it defensive in nature?
Of course it is. It is exactly that. You know, when I was a federal prosecutor, I used to sit on wiretaps for weeks or months, and this is the kind of language that hardened criminals would use. You know, kingpins and drug dealers. You know, who's flipping? Who do we want to go after? Who's on our side? I mean, listening to this is like listening to Tony Soprano. You know, this is really shocking to me. This kind of language. I don't want to go too far, but you know, Washington, Lincoln, Jefferson, they might be rolling over in their grave to think that a president of the United States is criticizing people who own responsibility, plead guilty, and decide to change their life, but yet, standing by the person who isn't going to be a rat. It's really, really upsetting.
Howard, it's one thing for the president to kind of use this language among his own inner circle in private, but he's using this language open in public to demean, to distance himself from, in interviews in an official capacity. What are your thoughts about the way Donald Trump is talking like a mob boss?
Well, he wants to do it publicly because this is the image he wants to project. he wants to be known as the mob boss in the White House. That's the whole manner of his upbringing, everything he was steeped in New York in the construction business and in dealing with people there, the way he's raised money, including from people who are reputed to be in the Russian mob, et cetera. He was coming into his own in New York and beginning in the business right around the time the Godfather movies were in the theaters in 72 and 74, and that's how he has consciously shaped himself. It's how he grew up in New York. It's what he thinks power is supposed to look like. So he's not going to hide it at all. He's going to advertise it. He also thinks that public threats are the way to go. In a way, he's like a bad mob boss because the mob bosses didn't do it in public. He's playing that role on television and playing it in the White House and playing it the way he thinks power is supposed to look.
Do you think it's going to do you think, Howard, that it undermines him in the long run, undermines any chance he's got in the long run?
Well, one would think so. But he's played. It's interesting because the longer he goes and the more he gets backed into a corner legally, the more he's behaving that way. He has some kind of faith that sells to the people who care about him most. It may, but in the process, he's going to lose the perimeter of whatever support he has. Those suburban voters, the people who believe in the idea of decency and the rule of law, ultimately are going to recoil. Maybe not now, but as soon as the report comes out and as soon as other facts are known. And I think somewhere in his mind, he has that sense, and he's preparing himself for that day.
Seth, you brought up the issue that you've sat in on many wiretaps over your career. Excuse me. Listen to the type of people that Trump surrounds himself with, because I'm going to play you this Michael Cohen talking to a reporter in 2015.
And I know exactly the story you plan on writing. So I'm warning you, tread very lightly, because what I'm going to do to you is going to be disgusting. Do you understand me?
What do you make of that language, Seth? What do you make of that threatening tone? This was one of the president's lawyers, one of his fixers, so to speak, a part of his inner circle.
Yeah, that's the true Michael Cohen. I mean, I understand Lanny Davis now is coming out and saying, Mr. Cohen has found religion or is back to his family or is putting country first. Look, I learned one thing as a federal prosecutor. People that are in the crosshairs of federal law enforcement care about one thing and one thing only. It is themselves. So I don't believe for a minute that he has now found his country. He has found himself in a corner, and he's doing everything that he can to help himself. That, what you heard on the tape, that is the true Michael Cohen, and when he was still a member of the conspiracy, assuming it existed.
All right, Howard Fineman, Seth Waxman, gentlemen, great to have both of you with us this Friday evening. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.